One bullet. That's all it took. One bullet fired on a summer morning in a city most people had never heard of. And within 6 weeks, the entire world was on fire. We're not talking about a small skirmish. We're not talking about a regional dispute between two nations settling old scores. We are talking about the industrialized slaughter of an entire generation. We are talking about a war so enormous, so incomprehensible in its scale, that the people living through it simply called it the Great War, because they couldn't imagine anything greater. They were wrong, of course. Something greater was coming. But that's a story for another time. This is the story of how a world that thought it was the most civilized, most enlightened, most modern civilization in human history tore itself apart in 4 years of blood, mud, gas, and grinding mechanical death. This is World War I, and it begins not with armies, but with a teenager and a sandwich. Everything is fine, it isn't. Let's set the scene. The year is 1914, and if you were a wealthy, educated European, things looked pretty good. London was the financial capital of the world. Paris was the cultural capital. Berlin was the scientific capital. Vienna was Vienna, which is basically the capital of being incredibly dramatic while wearing very elaborate uniforms. Europe in 1914 was modern. They had electric lights, telephones, automobiles, airplanes. The Wright brothers had flown only 11 years earlier, and already military planners were figuring out how to strap bombs to those things. They had cinema. They had jazz, imported from America, but still, they had department stores and fashion magazines and international tourism. The rich got richer. The middle class grew. Trade between nations exploded. In 1914, Britain and Germany were each other's largest trading partners. Economic historians looked at this web of international commerce and said, no nation would be stupid enough to go to war. The economic damage would be catastrophic. Rational self-interest would prevent it. Those economists were profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Because while the balance sheets looked great underneath the surface, underneath the Viennese waltzes and the Parisian cafes and the London banking houses, Europe was sitting on a powder keg. And the fuses had been lit for decades. Let's talk about those fuses. Fuse number 1, the great power rivalry. For the previous 200 years, the dominant power in Europe had been Great Britain, the British Empire, and we need to pause here and really absorb this. The British Empire at its peak controlled roughly 25% of the entire land surface of Earth. 1 in 4 humans on this planet lived under the British flag. That is an almost incomprehensible amount of power. But here comes Germany. Germany as a unified nation was only founded in 1871, barely 40 years before our story begins. Before that, it was a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities. But once unified under the iron will of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the military genius of the Prussian state, Germany industrialized at a speed that shocked the world. By 1900, German industrial output had surpassed Britain's. German science dominated Nobel Prize lists. The German military was widely regarded as the finest in the world. Britain had ruled the waves for a century. But Germany started building a navy. And not just any navy. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, wanted a navy capable of challenging British supremacy. Ship for ship, gun for gun. The British watched this and felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear. 2 great powers. One old, one new. Each watching the other with suspicion and calculation. This kind of rivalry, historians call it a hegemonic competition, has a depressingly consistent historical pattern. It usually ends in war. Fuse number 2, the alliance system. Bismarck, for all his warmongering reputation, was actually a genius of restraint when it came to keeping Europe's peace. He knew Germany needed time to consolidate, so he built an elaborate system of alliances designed to prevent any two-front war. He kept France isolated. He kept Russia friendly. He kept Austria-Hungary on a leash. Then in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II fired Bismarck, and the carefully constructed architecture of European diplomacy started to crack. Without Bismarck's steady hand, the alliances shifted. Russia drifted toward France. Britain, alarmed by German naval expansion, started talking to France and then to Russia. What had been Bismarck's carefully balanced system calcified into two armed camps staring at each other across the continent. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Italy, we will see, would turn out to be flexible in its commitments. On the other side, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. Now here's the terrifying thing about this arrangement. Each alliance had a triggering mechanism. If one member was attacked, the others were obligated to come to its defense. This seemed like a great deterrent. Nobody would attack France because that meant fighting Britain and Russia. Nobody would attack Germany because that meant fighting Austria-Hungary too. What nobody adequately considered was the scenario where the triggering events happened by accident, where a small, localized conflict in one corner of Europe would, through the mechanical operation of these treaty obligations, drag the entire continent into a war that none of the major powers might actually want. The alliance system was not a peace mechanism. It was a war amplifier. It turned any local conflict into a continental catastrophe. Fuse number 3, nationalism, the 19th century's deadliest export. Here's an idea that sounds reasonable on its face. People who share a language, a culture, and a history should govern themselves. They should have their own nation. Nationalism, self-determination, saudze fine. Unless you're governing an empire that contains about a dozen different national groups, each of whom has decided they want their own nation, and several of whom want the same piece of land. Welcome to Austria-Hungary. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914 was a magnificent, decaying, deeply anxious entity. It ruled over Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenians, Croatians, Bosnians, Serbs, Italians, and Romanians, to name most but not all. Emperor Franz Joseph had been on the throne since 1848. He was 83 years old in 1914 and had outlived his wife, assassinated, his son, suicide, and most of his generation. The empire was cracking. Nationalist movements everywhere. In the south, particularly in the newly expanded Kingdom of Serbia, there was a powerful dream. Unite all the South Slavic peoples, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, into one great nation, Greater Serbia, or perhaps Yugoslavia, the land of the South Slavs. Austria-Hungary looked at Serbia and saw an existential threat. If Serbian nationalism succeeded, if the principle that all Slavic people deserved a homeland took hold, the empire would fragment. It would dissolve. It would cease to exist. And Russia, as the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, watched Serbia with deep sympathy and strategic interest. So there you have it. Imperial rivalry, a hair-trigger alliance system, explosive nationalism, and backing all of it. A military machine that had been preparing for war for decades, whose general staffs had detailed plans for mobilizing millions of men in days, and whose soldiers had been told that the next war would be short, glorious, and decisive. The powder keg was ready. All it needed was a spark. Gavrilo Princip's terrible, horrible, very bad good luck, June 28, 1914.
Sarajevo, Bosnia.
A Sunday. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is visiting the city with his wife, Sophie. He's there on a state visit, partly diplomatic, partly a show of imperial authority over Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary had formally annexed just 6 years earlier over the furious objections of Serbia. Franz Ferdinand was not a universally beloved figure within his own empire. He was stubborn, short-tempered, and controversial, notably because he had made a morganatic marriage, meaning he'd married Sophie Chotek, a woman considered beneath his rank. Their children could not inherit. But Franz Ferdinand loved her deeply and fiercely. This trip to Sarajevo was special. It was one of the few occasions of public ceremony where Sophie, as his wife, could ride beside him in official capacity rather than trailing behind as protocol demanded. He was showing the world his wife with the pride of a man who had fought for that right. In the crowd, a group of 7 assassins waited. They were members of a secret organization called the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist group with murky connections to Serbian military intelligence. Their goal: kill the Archduke, destabilize Austrian control of Bosnia, advance the cause of South Slav unification. The operation, frankly, did not go well at first. The motorcade passed the first assassin, he froze, didn't throw his bomb. Moment missed. The second assassin, Nedeljko Kabrnovic, threw his bomb. It bounced off the back of the Archduke's car and exploded under the following vehicle, wounding several officers and bystanders. The Archduke, in a moment of remarkable personal courage, ordered his car to stop, checked on the wounded, and then continued to City Hall for the scheduled reception. A man had just tried to kill him. He went to his meeting. After the reception, he decided to visit the wounded officers in the hospital. His driver was told to change the route, but nobody told him which route. The driver turned down the original planned road, the wrong road, and was told by an aide to stop and reverse. He stopped, right in front of a delicatessen called Schiller's, right in front of a 19-year-old boy named Gavrilo Princip, who had given up on the assassination attempt and stopped for a sandwich. Gavrilo Princip looked up, and there, stopped not 10 feet away, was the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Princip pulled out his pistol and fired twice. One bullet hit Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. One hit Sophie in the abdomen. Franz Ferdinand's last words, as he held his dying wife, were reportedly, Sapperl, Sapperl.
Sterbe nicht. Bleibe am Leben für unsere Kinder.
Sophie dear, don't die. Stay alive for our children. Both were dead within the hour. Now, here's the thing about this assassination that most people don't fully appreciate. Assassinations happened. They happened fairly regularly in the volatile political climate of early 20th century Europe. Empress Elizabeth of Austria had been assassinated in 1898. King Umberto I of Italy in 1900. King Alexander of Serbia in 1903. These were tragedies. They were crises. They were not world wars. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand did not cause World War I in any simple mechanical sense. It was the trigger, but what the trigger ignited was a powder keg that had been building for 40 years. What happened next, in the 5 weeks between the assassination and the declaration of war, is one of the most studied, debated, and argued over episodes in modern history. Scholars call it the July Crisis, and it is a masterclass in how great powers, acting in what they each believe to be rational self-interest, can stumble into a catastrophe nobody actually wants. Let's walk through it. Week 1, Austria-Hungary's decision. Vienna is furious. There's outrage, grief, but also, among the hardliners in the Austro-Hungarian government, something almost like relief. They've been looking for an excuse to crush Serbia for years. Here it is. But Austria-Hungary can't move against Serbia without knowing Germany has its back. Russia will defend Serbia, and fighting Russia alone is not great. So they ask Germany, if we move against Serbia, will you support us? On July 5th and 6th, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg give what historians have called the blank check, essentially unconditional German support for whatever Austria-Hungary decides to do regarding Serbia. This is a catastrophic decision. Germany hands Austria-Hungary a loaded gun and tells them to point it wherever they like. Why did Germany do this? There are competing theories. Some historians believe Germany actually wanted a continental war at this particular moment, before Russia completed its military modernization program, which was expected around 1917, and before the Entente powers grew stronger. Others believe it was reckless miscalculation. They thought Russia would back down, as it had during previous Balkan crises. Others believe it was a failure of leadership. Wilhelm was impulsive, his chancellor weak, his military advisors already committed to the war plan. Whatever the reason, the blank check set the mechanism in motion. Weeks 2 and 3, the ultimatum. Austria-Hungary spends nearly 3 weeks drafting their ultimatum to Serbia. They want it to be impossible to accept, a casus belli wrapped in diplomatic language. The ultimatum, delivered on July 23rd, was extraordinary in its demands. It essentially required Serbia to allow Austro-Hungarian officials to participate in the investigation of the assassination on Serbian soil, a direct violation of Serbian sovereignty. The Serbs, with Russia's nervous encouragement, replied with remarkable compliance. They accepted almost everything, almost. On the points they couldn't accept without completely surrendering their sovereignty, they offered compromise language, arbitration, international mediation. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II, reading the Serbian reply, reportedly scrawled in the margins, "A great moral success for Vienna, but with it every reason for war drops away." He was right. The diplomatic off-ramp was right there. Austria-Hungary rejected it anyway and declared war on Serbia on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination. Week 4. The dominoes fall. Now the alliance system does exactly what it was designed to do, and precisely what its worst critics feared. Russia begins mobilizing in defense of Serbia. Partial mobilization at first, then full. Germany, seeing Russian mobilization on its eastern border, demands Russia stand down. Russia refuses. Germany declares war on Russia August 1st. France is allied with Russia. Germany declares war on France too, August 3rd. And here's where it gets truly insane. Germany's war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who devised it, requires attacking France through Belgium and Luxembourg, not through the heavily fortified Franco-German border. In and out through Belgium, knock France out in 6 weeks, then turn east to deal with Russia. Except Belgium is a neutral country. Its neutrality has been guaranteed by treaty since 1839, a treaty signed by, among others, Great Britain. Germany invades Belgium on August 4th. Britain declares war on Germany that same day. In 4 days, a war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, a war over a regional Balkan dispute, has become a war between the 5 greatest powers in the world. The Ottoman Empire joins later. So does Italy, switching sides naturally. So does Japan, on Britain's side. Within months, soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, Senegal, Morocco, Algeria, Vietnam, and dozens of other places are dying in the fields of Europe. A Serbian nationalist pistol has set the world on fire. And everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. Everyone is wrong about everything. Here's what they expected. The generals and the politicians and the newspapers, they expected a short, decisive war. A war of movement, cavalry, charges and bold flanking maneuvers and dramatic battles decided in days. The 19th century model of warfare, Napoleonic in style if not in tactics. Germany's Schlieffen Plan. Sweep through Belgium, encircle Paris, knock France out in 6 weeks. Then pivot east. Total war. Over before winter. France's Plan 17. Launch an immediate massive offensive into the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, taken by Germany in the last war, 1871. French elan, spirit, aggression, fighting ardor would carry the day. They would take back what was theirs. What actually happened was one of the most shocking military realities in history, and it was a reality that military theorists had been warning about for a decade, if anyone had listened. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 had been fought with relatively primitive rifles. By 1914, both sides had bolt-action magazine rifles capable of sustained accurate fire at 800 meters. Both sides had heavy machine guns, the Maxim gun and its descendants, capable of firing 400 to 600 rounds per minute. Both sides had quick-firing 75mm and 77mm artillery pieces that could deliver dozens of shells per minute. The firepower available to early 20th century armies was unprecedented. And what that firepower meant, what the Boer War had already demonstrated, what the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 2005 had screamed at anyone paying attention, was that troops advancing across open ground against entrenched defenders would be massacred. The defenders had an enormous, overwhelming advantage. Attack had become almost impossibly costly against modern firepower. But nobody wanted to believe that, because if it was true, if attack was essentially suicidal against modern weapons, then the whole theory of decisive offensive warfare was dead. And the generals had built their careers, their plans, their entire military philosophy around offensive warfare. So they didn't quite believe it, and millions of men paid the price. The opening weeks of the war were a charnel house. France launched its offensives into Alsace-Lorraine with soldiers in blue coats and red trousers, spectacularly visible targets, charging uphill against German defensive positions. The slaughter was immediate and appalling. In 1 week of fighting in late August, France suffered roughly 300,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. In 1 week. On the German side, the Schlieffen Plan initially worked brilliantly. The Great Wheeling movement through Belgium swept hundreds of miles in weeks. Belgian and British forces were pushed back. The French army was staggering. Paris seemed within reach. Then it started to unravel. The German forces were exhausted from weeks of marching, sometimes 30-plus miles per day in summer heat. Supply lines stretched. Communications broke down. 2 German army commanders on the right wing, Bülow and Kluck, made independent decisions that opened a gap in the German line. The French, with remarkable intelligence and flexibility, spotted the gap. The famous taxis of the Marne, a fleet of Parisian taxicabs commandeered to rush French reserve troops to the front, has been somewhat mythologized, but the Battle of the Marne in early September was real, significant, and decisive. The German advance stopped. They retreated to defensible ground along the Aisne River, and then both sides did something that would define the next 4 years. They dug. When you can't advance and you can't retreat, you dig a hole and make the enemy come to you. Both sides understood this instinctively, and so, in September and October of 1914, both the Allied and German forces began a process that historians call the Race to the Sea, essentially both sides trying to outflank each other to the north, each time being met by a new defensive position, each time digging in, each time extending the line further north. By November 1914, the Western Front was essentially fixed. A continuous line of trenches stretched from the English Channel coast in Belgium all the way south through France to the Swiss border, approximately 700 kilometers. 700 kilometers of trenches. And these weren't just ditches. Over the next 4 years, both sides would build elaborate systems of frontline trenches, second-line support trenches, third-line reserve trenches, communication trenches connecting them all, command bunkers, ammunition stores, hospital stations, mess halls, essentially underground cities of war, extending sometimes 5 miles deep. Between the opposing front lines lay no man's land. Anywhere from 30 meters to several hundred meters of barbed wire, shell craters, mud, bodies, and death. No man could cross it without being killed. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. Before we dive into the trenches, let's note that the Western Front was only half the story. On the Eastern Front, the war looked very different. The distances were vast, thousands of kilometers of frontier between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. The trench lines never fully solidified the way they did in the West. There was movement, sometimes dramatic movement, as armies advanced and retreated across the Great Plains of Poland and the Ukraine and the Carpathian Mountains. The Russian army was enormous, the largest in the world by numbers, but was plagued by problems. Supply shortages were chronic. By 1915, some Russian soldiers arrived at the front without rifles, told to pick one up from a fallen comrade when the shooting started. Transportation infrastructure was inadequate. The officer corps was hamstrung by the Tsarist system, where aristocratic connections often mattered more than military competence. In August 1914, the Russians launched an offensive into East Prussia, 2 armies. Advancing in a pincer movement meant to threaten Berlin and relieve pressure on France. At the Battle of Tannenberg, the German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff completely surrounded and destroyed one entire Russian army. Over 90,000 Russian prisoners were taken. The general commanding the encircled Russian Second Army killed himself. Tannenberg was a German tactical masterpiece, and it made Hindenburg and Ludendorff into national heroes, war gods to the German public, towering over everyone including the Kaiser himself. But despite Tannenberg, Germany could not knock Russia out of the war in 1914. And Russia, for all its problems, kept fighting. The Eastern Front became a grinding war of its own, less static than the West, but no less brutal. The geography of hell. I want you to stop thinking about maps and battle plans for a moment. I want you to think about a man. Let's call him Thomas. He's 22 years old, from a village in rural Yorkshire. He volunteered in September 1914, caught up in the wave of patriotic excitement, told by his recruiting sergeant that the war would be over by Christmas. He trained for 3 months in England. He crossed the Channel. He marched to the front. And now he is standing in a trench. The trench is about 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The walls are reinforced with wooden planks called revetments. But in wet weather the planks give way and the mud walls collapse, and men have been buried alive in such collapses. At the bottom of the trench there's a narrow raised platform called the fire step, where men stand to look over the parapet when required. Under their feet is a wooden platform called duckboarding, placed over the permanent 6 inches of water that seem to occupy every trench in Flanders, regardless of drainage efforts. The trench smells of mud, human waste, unwashed bodies, rotting sandbags, and something else. Something Thomas is desperately trying not to identify. Somewhere in no man's land, perhaps 20 meters away, there is a body that has been there since the last attack. 3 weeks ago, the trench smells of that too. It is November. It is cold. Thomas's feet have been wet for 11 days without interruption. He doesn't know it yet, but he is beginning to develop a condition that will disable hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides. Trench foot. The tissues of the feet, soaked for days in cold water and mud, begin to break down. In severe cases, gangrene sets in. Feet are amputated. Thomas is cold. He is hungry. Rations have been irregular because the supply lines are under intermittent artillery fire. He is tired. He has barely slept in 72 hours. The artillery never entirely stops. This is normal. This is every day. Nothing defined the Western Front experience more than artillery. On both sides, the guns never stopped for long. Shells of every caliber, from small trench mortars to the enormous siege howitzers that could send a shell the weight of a small car several miles, fell day and night, destroying the landscape, destroying the mind. The scale of artillery use in World War I is almost incomprehensible. Before the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British artillery fired over 1.5 million shells in the preliminary bombardment. A 7-day barrage intended to cut the German barbed wire, destroy their trenches, and kill enough defenders that the infantry assault would be relatively straightforward. When the barrage lifted on July 1, 1916, and the British infantry went over the top, they found that the wire was largely intact. The German defenders, sheltering in deep concrete bunkers that the artillery hadn't reached, emerged with their machine guns and mowed down the advancing British infantry. The Battle of the Somme on its first day, July 1, 1916, produced approximately 57,000 British casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. In one day, it remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. The artillery shaped the landscape of the Western Front into something lunar, alien. A wasteland of shell craters, splintered trees, collapsed buildings. Villages ceased to exist. Towns vanished. The Ypres salient, a bulge in the Allied line around the Belgian city of Ypres, was fought over 3 times, and by the end of the war the city itself had been essentially erased. Photographs from 1918 Ypres show nothing. A few tumbled stones. Otherwise, a flat field of mud. The machine gun changed warfare forever. A single well-positioned machine gun crew of 3 men could defend a frontage against which an attacking company of 100 men would be mown down in minutes. The math was savage and simple. The defender, in a prepared position with overhead cover, could kill attackers crossing open ground at a rate that made any frontal assault virtually suicidal. Military commanders on both sides knew this. They knew it theoretically, but they also knew they had to do something. You couldn't just sit in trenches forever. You had to take ground. You had to advance. That's what war was. That's what victory meant. And so they kept attacking, and kept losing men, and kept attacking again. The phrase "lions led by donkeys" became attached to the British experience of World War I, brave soldiers, incompetent generals. The reality was more complex. The generals were not, in general, fools. They were men trying to solve an unprecedented tactical problem. How do you break through a fortified line defended by machine guns and artillery? With tools that hadn't evolved quickly enough to solve it. Some of them adapted brilliantly. Some of them were indeed limited, even callous. All of them operated under political and strategic pressures that made humane caution difficult. But the men in the trenches didn't see the strategic picture. They saw the mud and the wire and the machine gun nests and the body of the friend they'd grown up with, lying in no man's land. They called it hell. Every one of them, in every memoir, in every letter home, called it some variation of hell. And they are not wrong. There was another casualty of the Western Front that the armies didn't know how to handle. Men who survived the physical violence began to break down in other ways. Uncontrollable shaking, inability to speak, paralysis without physical cause, nightmares, flashbacks, reliving of experiences so vivid the men couldn't distinguish memory from reality, hysteria, mutism, an inability to walk or to stop walking, an inability to stop crying. The medical establishment at the time had no framework for what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They called it shell shock, initially theorizing it was caused by concussive pressure waves from artillery explosions physically damaging the brain. That explained some cases, not all. As the war went on and shell shock cases multiplied, by war's end, over 80,000 men were treated for it in British forces alone. It became increasingly clear that the condition was psychological as much as physical. The mind, subjected to prolonged intolerable stress and horror, was simply breaking. The Army's response was mixed. Some doctors treated shell shock patients with genuine compassion and early psychological techniques, work for which some were later recognized as founders of modern psychological medicine. Other commanders and doctors viewed it with suspicion, as cowardice or malingering, and some men suffering from severe PTSD were court-martialed and shot for cowardice. Men who had gone to war healthy and whole came home hollowed out, shaking, unable to sleep, unable to forget. Many never recovered. Before we move on from the trenches, we must speak of Christmas. December 25, 1914, the Western Front. It has been 4 months of industrialized killing. And then, in several sectors along the front, nobody is entirely sure where it started. The guns fell silent. German soldiers put up Christmas trees on their parapet.
Licandre.
Began singing Christmas carols. From across no man's land, British soldiers heard Still Nacht, Silent Night, floating through the cold December air. They responded with their own carols. And then, cautiously, men began to climb out of their trenches, unarmed, into no man's land, where their enemy was doing the same. They shook hands. They exchanged cigarettes, chocolates, photographs. Some played football in the shell craters, the legend of the Christmas football match, though perhaps somewhat embellished in later tellings, contains a core of documented truth. In some sectors, both sides worked together to retrieve and bury their dead from no man's land. These were the same men who had been killing each other the week before, who would be killing each other again the week after. For one day, they were just men. The Christmas truce of 1914 has become one of the most emotionally resonant episodes of the entire war, precisely because it cuts through all the propaganda, all the nationalist fervor, all the military necessity, and reveals something painfully simple. The soldiers on both sides were human beings who, left to themselves, didn't particularly want to kill each other. The generals on both sides were furious when they heard about it. Orders were issued forbidding any repetition. In later years of the war, the Christmas truces were fewer and more localized. By 1917 and 1918, largely ended. The war had gone too deep. The hatred had become too real. Gallipoli, gas, and the world at war, the Western Front was the heart of the war. But it was not the whole war. In 1915, as the stalemate hardened in France and Belgium, the British government, with the energetic advocacy of First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill, looked for a way to break the deadlock indirectly. Attack Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire. Open a new front. Knock Turkey out of the war. Open supply lines to Russia. Maybe even knock Austria-Hungary out through the soft underbelly of Europe. The target, the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, guarded by the Ottoman shore batteries at Gallipoli. The plan: a naval assault to force the strait, followed by a land invasion to capture Constantinople, modern
Istanbul.
The execution: one of the most catastrophic military failures in British history. The naval assault in March 1915 hit minefields. 3 battleships sunk, 3 more damaged. The attack was called off. Then came the land invasion in April. The forces landing at Gallipoli, British, Australian, New Zealand, French, and Indian troops, faced a problem immediately apparent. The terrain was atrocious. Steep cliffs, rocky ravines, barely any flat ground. The Ottoman defenders, under the inspiring command of a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become Ataturk, father of modern Turkey, held the high ground. The beach landings were nightmares. At Anzac Cove, the landing site for Australian and New Zealand forces, the Anzacs, the troops came ashore in the wrong place due to current drift, landing at the base of cliffs instead of the intended beach. Ottoman defenders poured fire down on them. Men were killed in the boats, in the water, on the sand. The Anzacs held on. They dug in. They climbed the cliffs under fire and seized positions that seemed impossible. But they couldn't break through. For 8 months, Allied forces clung to tiny beachheads on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The fighting was as brutal as anything on the Western Front. But with the added misery of dysentery, typhoid, the searing heat of a Mediterranean summer, flies everywhere, inadequate water. The Ottoman forces, defending their homeland, fought with extraordinary tenacity. In December 1915, the Allies evacuated. Gallipoli was abandoned. The only successful part of the entire campaign was the evacuation itself. Conducted with remarkable skill, not a single man lost. The Butcher's Bill: approximately 500,000 casualties on both sides. Over 130,000 dead. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a founding national myth. Anzac Day, April 25th, is still the most solemn national day in both countries, commemorating the courage and sacrifice of those young men who died on those Turkish cliffs. Many Australians and New Zealanders would argue that their sense of national identity, distinct from British identity, was forged at Gallipoli. For Churchill, it was a career catastrophe. He resigned from the cabinet and went to serve as an infantry officer on the Western Front. An extraordinary act, whatever one thinks of the man. His political career was not entirely over, of course, but it would be a long time before he was trusted again. April 22nd, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. Second Battle of Ypres. As the sun went down and the wind shifted to blow toward the Allied lines, French soldiers in the trenches noticed a yellowish-green cloud drifting toward them from the German trenches. They didn't know what it was. Some thought it was a smoke screen. They watched it come. It was chlorine gas. The gas rolled into the Allied trenches, filled the lungs. It turned to hydrochloric acid in contact with moisture, burning airways, causing fluid to fill the lungs. Soldiers died coughing up yellow froth. Those who ran, breathing hard in their panic, absorbed more gas and died faster. Within minutes, a 4-mile gap had been torn in the Allied line. The Germans could have walked through, but they were cautious. They hadn't expected the gas to work quite so well, hadn't planned adequately to exploit the breakthrough. The gap was eventually plugged, but chemical warfare had arrived. Within weeks, both sides were using gas. Chlorine gave way to phosgene, more effective, harder to detect, accounting for most gas-related deaths in the war. And then, in 1917, Germany introduced the worst of them all, mustard gas. Mustard gas was a blister agent. It didn't kill immediately. It clung to the ground and to clothing. It caused massive blisters on skin and in airways. It blinded men, temporarily, sometimes permanently. It contaminated equipment, ground, everything it touched. Gas masks became standard issue. But masks were imperfect. Mustard gas could penetrate through skin, through clothing. Horses, and both sides used enormous numbers of horses, had no effective gas protection. One soldier who was temporarily blinded by a mustard gas attack in Belgium in October 1918 was a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler. He was recovering in a military hospital when the war ended. His account of the defeat and of what he believed caused Germany's defeat would shape the next catastrophe. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Gas accounted for roughly 1.3 million casualties and perhaps 91,000 deaths in the war, significant, but a small percentage of total casualties. Its primary impact was psychological. The constant fear of invisible, choking death contributed enormously to the mental horror of the Western Front. The use of poison gas was, by any reasonable moral standard, a war crime. The international community, after the war, agreed the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned chemical weapons in war, a prohibition honored broadly for the next century. The war wasn't only fought on land. Britain depended utterly on maritime trade, food, oil, raw materials, munitions. Control the seas and you could strangle Britain. Germany had built that magnificent navy. But in 1914, the British Grand Fleet was still larger, and it immediately moved to blockade Germany, preventing supplies from reaching German ports. The German Navy, unwilling to risk its big ships in a battle it might lose, largely stayed in port. The British blockade was devastating. By 1917, Germany faced serious food shortages. Rationing was harsh. The civilian population suffered. Historians estimate several 100,000 German civilians died from hunger and disease related to the blockade over the course of the war. Germany's response was the submarine. The U-boat, Unterseeboot, was Germany's answer to British naval supremacy. If German surface ships couldn't fight the Royal Navy, German submarines would sink British merchant shipping, strangle Britain's supply lines, force a negotiated peace. In February 1915, Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone. Any ship, including neutral ones, was liable to be sunk without warning. This was legally and diplomatically explosive. International law required warships to stop merchant vessels, allow passengers to evacuate, then sink them. A submarine couldn't do that. It was too vulnerable on the surface. So submarine warfare, by its nature, meant attacking without warning. On May 7, 1915, the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. 1,198 people died, including 128 Americans. The American reaction was furious. Germany, fearing American entry into the war, pulled back its unrestricted submarine campaign. For now, Verdun, the Somme, and the end of innocence, if any year defined the absolute worst of the Western Front, it was 1916. 2 battles, both with the same strategic objective: break the enemy. Break them by killing so many of their soldiers that they have no choice but to surrender or collapse. The word that both commanders used in their planning documents, in their private papers, in their conversations with staff, the word was attrition. They intended to grind the enemy down. They intended to win by simply killing more of the enemy than the enemy killed of them. What they actually achieved was a slaughter so enormous, so catastrophic, so utterly disproportionate to any strategic gain, that it has served ever since as the defining symbol of futility, of the industrial madness of modern war. General Erich von Falkenhayn, German Chief of Staff, devised a plan he called, in a chilling planning document, a strategy to bleed France white. He chose Verdun. Verdun was a French fortress city of enormous symbolic importance. It had never fallen to a German attack, going back centuries. Falkenhayn calculated that France would throw every available soldier into defending Verdun, and that German artillery in overwhelming concentration could kill them faster than France could replace them. He was, in a terrible way, not wrong. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, with the largest artillery bombardment in history to that point, over 1 million shells in the opening hours. German forces advanced. French forces reeled. Then France stiffened. The road into Verdun, the Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, was kept open by an endless stream of trucks, hundreds per hour, 24 hours a day. French commanders rotated their divisions through Verdun. Eventually, almost every division in the French army fought there. The French held, and the killing went on. For 10 months, Falkenhayn's plan failed in its original conception. French casualties were enormous, yes, but German casualties were nearly as severe. The machinery of slaughter killed both sides with democratic indifference. By the time Verdun ended in December 1916, there had been approximately 700,000 casualties, 300,000 dead. For an area roughly the size of a few city blocks, there are still areas around Verdun today that are permanently off-limits. The soil is so saturated with the remains of the dead, with unexploded shells, with toxic chemicals from a century ago, that it cannot safely be inhabited or farmed. They are called the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, ghost countryside, abandoned to the war's permanent legacy. While Verdun was grinding on in the south, the British launched their own offensive in the north, partly to relieve the pressure on France. The Battle of the Somme, July 1, 1916. 57,470 British casualties on the first day. That number again, 57,470 men. In one day, roughly 19,000 of them died. Most of the casualties occurred in the first hour. The preliminary artillery bombardment, 1.5 million shells over 7 days, had failed to destroy the German deep bunkers. The wire was largely intact. As British soldiers climbed over their parapets and walked in many places because officers had been told the German defenders would be too stunned to resist and there was no need to run. Across no man's land, the German machine gunners emerged from their bunkers and opened fire. Whole battalions were annihilated. The PALS battalions, units recruited from particular towns or neighborhoods or occupational groups, men who had joined up together on the promise of serving alongside their friends, were devastated. In some towns in northern England, virtually every young man was killed in a single morning. A PALS battalion raised in Accrington, Lancashire, the Accrington PALS, suffered 585 casualties out of 720 men in the first hour at the Somme. Think about that. A town, community, their entire male generation. In an hour, the Battle of the Somme continued for 4.5 months. The eventual Allied advance was 7 miles, about 11 kilometers. The total casualties, over 1 million men on both sides. 7 miles, 1 million casualties. Those numbers sit alongside each other in the historical record like an accusation. The Somme also saw the first use of a weapon that would define warfare for the rest of the century. The tank. Churchill, out of the cabinet but determined to find a technological solution to the machine gun problem, had championed the development of a heavily armored, tracked vehicle that could cross trenches, crush wire, and protect infantry from machine gun fire. The first tanks were used on September 15, 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. There were only 49 of them. Many broke down before reaching the front, and their tactical use was fragmented and poorly coordinated. But where they worked, where they advanced together with infantry, they were terrifying and effective. German soldiers who had held their positions against everything else broke and ran before these lumbering steel monsters. The generals were intrigued. The development continued. The next 2 years would see tanks become increasingly refined and used in greater numbers. The tank was a hint, just a hint, that the deadlock might eventually be broken. Amid all the carnage and futility of 1916, one operation stood out as a masterpiece of offensive tactics. The Brusilov Offensive on the Eastern Front. June through September 1916. General Alexei Brusilov of the Russian Army had been studying the problem of breaking through trench defenses and had arrived at several innovations that would be developed further by all powers in the later war. Instead of concentrating the attack at one point, which allowed the enemy to predict and concentrate their reserves, Brusilov attacked on a very broad front simultaneously at multiple points. The preliminary artillery was short but precise, destroying specific defensive positions rather than randomly demolishing the landscape. Infantry advanced in small, flexible groups rather than rigid lines. The result was spectacular. Austrian lines crumbled. In the first days, Brusilov's forces advanced dramatically and took hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The Brusilov offensive ultimately caused about 1.5 million Austro-Hungarian casualties, effectively crippling Austro-Hungarian military power for the rest of the war, and forced Germany to divert major forces from both Verdun and the Somme to shore up the Eastern Front. It was the most successful Allied offensive of the entire war to that point. Brusilov achieved it by thinking differently, by rejecting the conventional wisdom about how offensives had to be conducted. The tragedy is that Russia was running out of time to benefit from his genius. America, Arabia, and the Ottoman apocalypse, the war did not stay contained to Europe. Let's look at the wider world. When the Ottoman Empire joined the war on Germany's side in late 1914, it brought enormous territories into the conflict: the Middle East, Arabia, the Caucasus. For Britain and France, the Ottoman threat meant protecting Egypt, the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf oil fields, and India. For Russia, it meant a new front in the Caucasus. The British launched campaigns in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and Palestine, modern Israel, and the Palestinian territories. The Gallipoli disaster we've discussed. In Mesopotamia, an entire British Indian army was besieged and captured at Kut in 1916, another catastrophic defeat. But there was also one of the war's most romantic stories: the Arab Revolt. The British, looking for allies against the Ottomans, found them in the Hashemite rulers of the Hijaz, the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Sharif Hussein of Mecca launched an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, with British support including gold, weapons, and the services of a young British intelligence officer and scholar, T. Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia, was a man of extraordinary complexity. Fluent in Arabic, deeply knowledgeable of Arab culture, genuinely sympathetic to Arab nationalism, and also entirely caught up in the romance of what he was doing. He helped coordinate Bedouin guerrilla forces in raids on Ottoman rail lines, disrupting supply routes. He led the Arab capture of Aqaba. He was present for the advance through Syria. He also made promises on behalf of Britain that Britain had no intention of keeping. The British and French governments, even as Lawrence was promising Arab leaders independence in exchange for revolt, were secretly drawing lines on a map. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 divided the post-war Middle East between British and French spheres of influence. The borders drawn by those two British and French diplomats, arbitrary lines through the desert, cutting across tribal and ethnic divisions, form the basis of Middle Eastern national borders today. The consequences of those borders in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Palestine remain with us to this hour. Lawrence, when he discovered the extent of British double-dealing, was devastated. He wrote about it in his memoir 7 Pillars of Wisdom with barely concealed anguish. He felt he had betrayed the men who had trusted him. He spent much of the rest of his life trying to forget. This is the point in the story where we must stop and speak about something that will not be romanticized, that has no heroic redemption, that represents one of history's darkest passages. The Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, used the cover of war to attempt the extermination of its Armenian population. The Armenians were a Christian minority in eastern Anatolia, with a population of approximately 2 million. Ottoman leadership, driven by ethnic nationalist ideology and fears of Armenian collaboration with Russia, some Armenian units had indeed joined Russian forces, decided on a policy of mass deportation. Beginning in April 1915, Armenians were rounded up across the empire. Intellectuals, community leaders, and professionals were arrested and killed. The general population, men, women, children, were marched into the Syrian desert. There was no food, no water, no shelter at the destination because there was no destination. They were marched to die. They died of starvation, thirst, exposure, disease. They were massacred by Ottoman soldiers and irregular forces. Women were raped, abducted, sold into slavery. Children were separated from parents. The death toll, approximately 1 to 1.5 million Armenians. Estimates vary. The destruction of records and the nature of the crime makes precision impossible. But the scale is not in serious historical dispute. It was a deliberate, organized attempt to eliminate an entire people. It was genocide. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who coined the word genocide in 1944, specifically cited the Armenian massacres as one of the events that led him to develop the concept. The Ottoman government and its successor state, Turkey, has never formally acknowledged this as genocide. The debate over whether to call it genocide remains politically charged to this day. The historical record is, however, unambiguous. The world watched and largely did nothing. Theodore Roosevelt called it the greatest crime of the war. Newspapers reported on it, and the world moved on. Hitler, 20 years later, when advisors worried about international reaction to his plans for the Jews, reportedly said, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Whether or not he said exactly those words, the sentiment was real, and the lesson he drew from the world's silence was real. Memory matters. Naming things matters. Silence is not neutral. When the war began in August 1914, the United States was neutral. President Woodrow Wilson asked Americans to be neutral in thought as well as deed. Essentially impossible, given that millions of Americans were recent immigrants from the warring nations, with loyalties and connections that didn't evaporate on reaching Ellis Island. American public opinion was divided but broadly leaned toward the Allies. The German invasion of neutral Belgium, widely reported in American newspapers, created a wave of sympathy for the Allied cause. British propaganda, sophisticated, effective, operating through newspapers and film and public lectures, relentlessly pushed the narrative of German barbarism, some genuine, some embellished, to American audiences. The German U-boat campaign, and specifically the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, created genuine outrage. But Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," and he won. Two events in early 1917 pushed America over the edge. First, Germany, desperate to end the war before it ran out of resources, resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. They gambled that they could knock Britain out of the war through starvation before American entry could make a difference. They gambled wrong. Second, the Zimmermann telegram. Arthur Zimmermann, German Foreign Secretary, sent a secret telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposing a military alliance. If the United States entered the war, Germany would help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. In exchange, Mexico would create a diversion on America's southern border. British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram. They shared it with the Americans, after carefully concealing how they'd obtained it, through a combination of tapping telegraph cables and breaking German codes, a fact that had enormous intelligence implications for the future. The American reaction was explosive. Mexico taking Texas back? The idea was simultaneously insulting and alarming in ways that resonated viscerally with the American public. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. It would take time. American forces wouldn't arrive in significant numbers until mid-1918. But the announcement alone changed the strategic equation dramatically. Germany now faced a war it definitively could not win. The industrial capacity of the United States, the manpower reserves, the financial depth, it tilted the balance irrevocably toward the Allies. The clock was running on Germany, and Germany's generals knew it. When the people said no by 1917, the war had been going for 3 years. The original 6-week plan had become a nightmare without apparent end. And the people, the soldiers, the workers, the civilians were beginning to say no. Russia in 1917 was a country at the breaking point. 3 years of catastrophic military losses. Hundreds of thousands dead. More wounded. The economy in shambles. Food shortages in the cities. The Tsar, Nicholas II, personally taking command of the army in 1915. A decision of breathtaking political stupidity, because it meant that every subsequent Russian military defeat was now personally his responsibility. And in the royal palace, the increasingly unhinged influence of Grigory Rasputin over the Tsarina Alexandra, and through her over the Tsar, had destroyed whatever remained of the Russian court's credibility. The nobility plotted. The Duma demanded reform. Revolutionary parties, suppressed for years, gained strength. In February 1917, March by the Western calendar, Russia still used the old Julian calendar. Bread riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, turned into revolution. Workers went on strike. Soldiers, crucially, refused to fire on the protesters. Some joined them. Nicholas II abdicated. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ended in days. A provisional government took over, committed to continuing the war, a catastrophic decision that the German High Command had carefully engineered. Germany, recognizing that Russia's continued war effort was the only thing keeping a Bolshevik revolution from happening faster, had facilitated the return of Vladimir Lenin from his exile in Switzerland. Lenin was transported across Germany in a sealed train. The sealed train has become legendary and arrived in Petrograd in April. Lenin's message was simple and devastating. Immediate peace. Land to the peasants. Power to the workers. Peace, land, bread. In October 1917, November by Western calendar, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. The provisional government fell. Lenin signed an armistice with Germany, and Russia left the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 ended the war on the Eastern Front. Russia surrendered enormous territories: Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Finland. It was a punishing peace, designed by Germany to extract maximum advantage. But for Germany, it meant that the Eastern Front was over. Divisions could be transferred west. Before American forces arrived in strength, Germany had one last chance to win. In France, the breaking point came differently. April 1917. General Robert Nivelle had promised his government, promised everyone, that his new offensive on the Chemin de Dames Ridge would break through the German line in 48 hours. His confidence was absolute. His planning was detailed. His rhetoric was magnificent. The Nivelle offensive was a catastrophe. The Germans had advance warning and had prepared. French casualties in the first days were enormous. The promised breakthrough never came. And then the French infantry said, "Enough. Not all of them, not everywhere, but across large portions of the French army. Regiments that had been bled white at Verdun, that had suffered through the Somme, that had charged across open ground into machine guns one too many times. Men refused orders to attack. They would defend. They would hold the trenches. They would not charge into no man's land and die uselessly anymore. These were not cowards. These were men who had endured more than any reasonable conception of human endurance should allow. They went on strike. Officially, 54 French divisions were affected. Some historians believe the actual number was higher. The French government and new military commander, General Philippe Pétain, handled the crisis with relative wisdom, improving conditions, rotating rest periods, investigating genuine grievances. Executions for mutiny were far fewer than the law allowed. The mutinies were suppressed, but carefully, without provoking a full collapse. But the British didn't know how bad things were, and so the British launched their own offensive to keep pressure off the recovering French. The Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, Belgium, August through November 1917. Unprecedented rainfall turned the already devastated Flemish plain into a swamp. Shells had destroyed the ancient drainage systems, and the clay soil of Flanders, waterlogged, became a sea of liquid mud. Men and horses literally drowned in shell holes. Wounded soldiers unable to move were swallowed by the mud. When it ended in November, the British had advanced about 5 miles and suffered roughly 275,000 casualties. Passchendaele has become, alongside the Somme, the defining image of Western Front futility. Even those who believe Douglas Haig, the British commander, was doing the best he could in impossible circumstances. Even sympathetic historians struggle with the orders issued to continue attacking through the mud of Passchendaele. The war changed the home fronts as profoundly as it changed the battle fronts. Modern industrial war requires enormous quantities of everything: shells, guns, food, uniforms, trucks, horses, fuel, wire, medicine. Producing all of this while simultaneously sending millions of men to fight required a fundamental restructuring of civilian economies. In every major combatant nation, governments took unprecedented control of industrial production, rationing, labor, and prices. This was total war in a new sense. The distinction between civilian and military, between the home front and the front line, essentially dissolved. And women stepped forward. As men left for the front in their millions, women entered the industrial workforce on a scale previously unimaginable. Women drove trams. Women worked in munitions factories. Dangerous work, highly toxic. The yellow skin of canary girls, who worked with TNT, became a grim badge of service. Women ran farms, managed businesses, drove ambulances in the war zones, served as nurses in conditions just behind the front lines. Suffragette movements in Britain and elsewhere largely suspended their political campaigns for the duration of the war, not because they gave up their goals, but because they understood that demonstrating women's capacity to contribute to national life was the most powerful argument they could make. When the war ended, the political calculus had changed irrevocably. Britain granted women over 30 the right to vote in 1918. Full female suffrage followed in 1928. In the United States, the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, was ratified in 1920. Germany and most other combatant nations similarly extended the franchise in the war's aftermath. The war that killed a generation of men also, in its terrible way, advanced women's equality by demonstrating unambiguously that women were full partners in national life. Germany's last gamble. By early 1918, Germany faced a strategic reality that its military leaders understood clearly, even if they couldn't say it publicly. Germany was losing. The British blockade had been devastating. German civilians were hungry. German industry was straining. German manpower reserves were thinning. American troops were arriving in France at the rate of 250,000 per month and would only increase. But Russia was out. Eastern Front divisions were available. For the first time in the war, Germany had a numerical advantage in the West. General Erich Ludendorff, the real military brain of the German war machine by this point, with the venerable Hindenburg serving largely as a symbolic figurehead, devised a plan. The spring offensives of 1918. Hit hard, hit fast before the Americans arrived in strength. Break through the British lines. Split the British from the French. Drive to the Channel. Force a negotiated peace before Germany ran out of everything. And Ludendorff had learned something. He'd studied Brusilov's methods. He'd developed new stormtrooper tactics, small, elite infiltration units armed with flamethrowers, light machine guns, and mortars. They would bypass strong points, penetrate deep, disrupt communications and supply, cut off forward positions from their rear. The follow-up mass infantry would eliminate the surrounded positions. These tactics were revolutionary. They were what modern infantry tactics still look like. March 21, 1918. The Western Front. At 4:40 in the morning, 6,473 German guns opened fire simultaneously along a 40-mile front, the heaviest bombardment in history. For 5 hours, the German artillery fired with extraordinary precision, targeting headquarters, artillery positions, communication lines, and supply depots, disrupting the defenders' ability to respond, rather than simply destroying the front-line trenches. Then the stormtroopers went in, aided by fog. The British line broke. By the end of the first day, the Germans had advanced further than any offensive had managed in years of fighting on the Western Front. The advance continued for days, then weeks. The deepest penetration was roughly 40 miles, enormous by Western Front standards. Paris was shelled by specially designed long-range guns, the Paris gun, the first modern long-range bombardment of a civilian city. Parisians began evacuating. The Allies, for the first time in the war, placed a single unified commander over all Allied forces in France, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. The separate national commands had always created coordination problems. Now, with the crisis acute, unity was finally achieved. Haig issued his famous backs-to-the-wall order. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The advance continued, but it was slowing. Germany's stormtroopers were the tip of a spear, not an army. They moved fast and they disrupted, But the mass of regular infantry following behind couldn't keep up with supply demands, couldn't hold all the ground taken. Communications broke down. And crucially, the stormtroopers, moving fast, came upon Allied supply depots that contained food, drink, and luxuries the German soldiers hadn't seen in years. Some stopped to ransack them, and the Americans were arriving. More operations followed: Operation Georgette, Operation Gneisenau, others. Each achieved initial successes. Each ran out of momentum before achieving decisive victory. By July, the spring offensives had cost Germany over 600,000 casualties. Irreplaceable casualties in the men they could least afford to lose, the stormtroopers, the best and most aggressive soldiers. Germany had shot its bolt. August 8, 1918. The Battle of Amiens. The Allied command, with Foch coordinating, Haig commanding British forces, Pétain commanding French forces, and American General John Pershing commanding the growing American Expeditionary Forces, launched a counteroffensive. And it was different from anything that had come before. The lessons of 4 years of brutal experimentation had been learned. The Allies now had effective tanks, the British Mark V and the lighter Whippet, in large numbers. They had achieved air superiority, with new aircraft protecting ground troops and providing reconnaissance. Artillery was now masterful at counter-battery fire, silencing enemy guns, and at providing close support to advancing infantry. The infantry itself had adopted flexible, small-group tactics similar to the German stormtroopers. Most importantly, everything was integrated. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry all worked together in a coordinated dance. At Amiens, German lines broke immediately. The German retreat was rapid. On August 8 alone, 30,000 German prisoners were taken. Ludendorff called August 8 the Black Day of the German Army. More specifically, it was the day Ludendorff realized that German soldiers were surrendering to relatively small Allied forces, were even, in some cases, surrendering willingly. The will to fight was breaking. What followed was the 100 Days Offensive, a series of Allied attacks that drove the Germans back month after month. The gains weren't the dramatic breakthroughs of newspaper headlines. No single decisive battle, no encirclement of enemy armies. Just relentless pressure. Miles taken every week. The German army was still fighting, still defending, still inflicting casualties. But it was retreating. And at home, Germany was collapsing. Armistice, and the peace that wasn't Germany's allies, were falling apart. Bulgaria signed an armistice in September 1918, the first of the Central Powers to quit. The Ottoman Empire followed in October. Austria-Hungary, that old, crumbling empire of a dozen nationalities, fell apart almost literally. Hungary declared independence, Czechoslovakia declared independence, Yugoslavia declared independence. What remained was a rump Austria, bewildered and diminished. It signed an armistice on November 3rd. Germany was alone. And within Germany, the pressure was becoming intolerable. The Naval High Command, in a final act of extraordinary hubris, ordered the German fleet out for a last great battle against the British, a heroic death rather than surrender. The sailors mutinied. In the port of Kiel, sailors raised red flags and refused orders. The mutiny spread. Workers' and soldiers' councils, rate on the Russian-Soviet model, began forming across Germany. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands, where he would live in comfortable exile for the next 23 years. A German republic was proclaimed from the balcony of the Reichstag. 2 days later, November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m., the guns stopped. An armistice, a ceasefire, was signed at 5 a.m. in a railway carriage in the Campine Forest. It took effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. After 4 years, 3 months, and 14 days. After millions of dead. After civilizations shattered and landscapes destroyed. After a generation of young men, German, French, British, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, Italian, Ottoman, American, and from every corner of every empire, consumed by the machine. The guns stopped. Soldiers on both sides wept. Some cheered. Some sat in silence. An American soldier named Henry Gunther was killed by German fire at 10:59 a.m., 60 seconds before the ceasefire. The official last casualty of the Western Front, killed in a war that was already effectively over. In the cities London, Paris, New York, there were celebrations. Wild, tearful, exhausted celebrations. In the trenches, the men who had survived sat and looked at the silence. January 1919 were planted, though to be fair, even contemporaries debated this and historians debate it still. The key players, Woodrow Wilson of the United States with his idealistic 14 points, a program for a new world order based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations to resolve future disputes peacefully. David Lloyd George of Britain, pragmatic, politically astute, aware that his domestic politics required punishing Germany but privately concerned about pushing Germany too hard. Georges Clemenceau of France, the tiger, 80 years old and iron-hard, who had lived through the Franco-Prussian War and the occupation of France in 1870, and who was absolutely determined that Germany should be so weakened it could never threaten France again. Italy and Japan were also present, pushing their own territorial claims. Germany was not present. The losers had no seat at the table. The peace was dictated to them. The result, the Treaty of Versailles, signed June 28, 1919, on the 5-year anniversary of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, was a compromise that satisfied almost no one. Germany lost territory. Alsace-Lorraine back to France, Polish territory creating the Polish Corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The port of Danzig became a free city. Germany lost all its overseas colonies. Germany's army was limited to 100,000 men, no air force, no submarines. Germany was required to admit sole guilt for causing the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause, Article 231, and to pay reparations for all damage caused. The reparations figure was eventually set in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum. Germany made its final payment on the reparations in 2010. Yes, 2010, nearly a century after the war ended. The War Guilt Clause was, whatever its legal and diplomatic utility, a profound psychological wound to Germany. The German public refused to believe their nation bore sole responsibility for the war. They were not entirely wrong. The question of war guilt has been debated by historians ever since, and the modern consensus is that responsibility was shared, though Germany's blank check to Austria-Hungary bears significant weight. The humiliation of Versailles, the sense of betrayal, the loss of territory, the crushing reparations, the blow to national pride, was weaponized by radical nationalist politicians in Weimar Germany. Adolf Hitler wrote about Versailles with incandescent fury in Mein Kampf. He built his entire political career around reversing its provisions and avenging its humiliations. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant young British economist who attended the Paris Peace Conference and resigned in protest, wrote a prescient book in 1919, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. He argued that the reparations were economically catastrophic and politically suicidal, that they would destabilize Germany, poison European politics, and lead to another war. He was right on every count. Woodrow Wilson poured all his remaining energy into one idea: the League of Nations, an international organization where member states would submit disputes to arbitration rather than war. Collective security. The idea that an attack on any member would be treated as an attack on all, deterring aggression through solidarity. It was a beautiful idea, and it was crippled at birth. Wilson took the League to the U.S. Senate for ratification. The Senate refused. America never joined the League of Nations. The country that had championed it most loudly retreated into isolationism, leaving the new international organization weakened from its first day. The League of Nations struggled on through the 1920s and 1930s, managing some disputes, achieving some genuine humanitarian work. But without American participation, without the ability to enforce its decisions militarily, without the will of its members to accept constraints on their sovereignty, it was a moral aspiration without the institutional power to match it. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League protested and did nothing. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions and then lifted them. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936 in direct violation of Versailles, nothing. The League died in practice long before it was formally dissolved in 1946. What it cost, what it left, what it meant. Let us count what was lost. Military dead, approximately 9 to 11 million. The uncertainty in those numbers is itself testimony to the chaos and scale. Some nations kept poor records, some records were destroyed. Civilian dead from direct violence, famine, and disease related to the war. Another 6 to 13 million. The range is enormous because the definition is contested and the data is incomplete. Include the 1918 influenza pandemic, which swept the world in the war's final year and immediate aftermath, killing somewhere between 17 million and 50 million people, spread partly through the movements of troops, and the mortality figure becomes staggering. Wounded, 21 million or more. Prisoners and missing, millions more. For empires destroyed, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, German. Maps redrawn across Europe, the Middle East, Africa. The British Empire, victorious, began the long process of slow dissolution, as colonies that had contributed enormous blood and resources began demanding and eventually winning independence. India's independence movement was radicalized by the war. Australia and New Zealand's national identities were forged at Gallipoli. The process would take decades, but the beginning of the end of the European empires was the Great War. The United States emerged as the world's dominant economic power, a creditor nation to the exhausted Europeans, its industrial capacity intact, its armies largely spared the worst of the slaughter. The 20th century would be the American century, and World War I was where that shift became irreversible. Russia became the Soviet Union, a new ideological empire that would contest the world with the West for the next 70 years. And then there were the men who came home, millions of them, changed beyond their ability to articulate, carrying things, nightmares, shattered nerves, missing limbs, damaged lungs from gas, faces rebuilt by early plastic surgeons from what the artillery had left of them, that their families and communities had no framework to understand. The poet Wilfred Owen, who survived the Somme and Passchendaele and returned to the front in 1918 and was killed in the final week of the war, 1 week before the armistice, wrote what many consider the definitive statement on the experience of the Western Front. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, and the most quoted lines in all of war poetry. If in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory. The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. The old lie. Owen's generation, the war poets, the lost generation, the writers and artists who survived, produced work of devastating power from what they had witnessed. Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Edmund Blunden, Erich Maria Remarque, whose All Quiet on the Western Front became the defining novel of the war's futility, Ernst Junger, who found something almost mystical in the violence, all of them trying to translate the untranslatable, to make people who hadn't been there understand what it had actually been. Some of what they wrote helped create the dominant modern narrative of World War I. Futile, pointless, lions led by donkeys, a generation sacrificed for nothing. This narrative is powerful. It is emotionally true. It is, as history, somewhat simplified. There were real stakes, real threats, real things being decided. The war was not entirely without meaning, but the gap between the meaning and the cost, that gap is what haunts every account of the Great War. Here is the terrible coda. Everything we have described, every acre of mud, every yard of wire, every shattered body, every ruined city, was, in a terrible sense, only the first act. The punitive Peace of Versailles, the economic chaos of the 1920s, the inflation that wiped out German savings, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the political radicalization that followed, all of it fed the rise of the man who made the next war. 21 years after the armistice, 21 years exactly, virtually to the month, the guns started again. The Second War was worse. The technology was more efficient. The ideology was more genocidal. The Holocaust, Hiroshima, 70 to 80 million dead. World War II was, in a real sense, the continuation of World War I. There was even a single figure who connected them. Hitler, the corporal who survived mustard gas in October 1918, who stood in that same railway car in the Campine Forest in June 1940 where the German armistice had been signed, who forced the French to sign their 1940 armistice in that same car, and then had the car destroyed so no future defeat could be signed there. His entire career was, in his own telling, a response to November 11, 1918. The Great War created the conditions for its own sequel, and the sequel made the Great War look like a rehearsal. Why it still matters a century has passed. The last veterans of World War I are gone. The last surviving veteran, Florence Green, a British servicewoman, died in 2012 at the age of 110. The last combat veteran, Claude Schul, died in 2011 at 110. The eyewitnesses are all gone, but the world they fought in, and the world they created by fighting, is still our world. The map of the Middle East, those straight lines drawn by Sykes and Picot, is still the map that shapes daily headlines about Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine. The tensions those lines created haven't resolved. They've compounded. The Russian Revolution that World War I enabled created the Soviet Union, which shaped the Cold War, which shaped everything about the second half of the 20th century, which left legacies we're still living with in the relationship between Russia and the West. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the humiliation of its successor states fed into the complex grievances that shape modern Turkish, Arab, and Middle Eastern politics today. The Armenian genocide, unacknowledged by Turkey, still politically contested, sits in the world's conscience like an unhealed wound, a reminder that mass atrocity can happen, that the world can watch and do nothing, and that the failure to name evil can enable more evil. The development of tanks, aircraft, submarines, and poison gas during World War I established the technological trajectory of 20th century warfare. The principles of industrial total war, mobilizing entire economies, targeting civilian infrastructure, the entanglement of home front and battle front, have shaped every conflict since. The experience of the war, the poetry, the memoirs, the novels, created a cultural vocabulary for the horror of modern warfare that has never been superseded. When we describe the futility of a pointless battle, we reach for the language and imagery of the Western Front. When we talk about going over the top, when we talk about shell shock or its modern descendant PTSD, when we talk about men being cannon fodder, we are drawing on the accumulated memory of 1914 to 1918. The war also produced remarkable human achievements. The medical advances born of treating millions of wounded men, in surgery, in prosthetics, in the early development of plastic surgery, in blood transfusion, in the management of infection, saved countless lives in the decades that followed. The logistical achievements, feeding, supplying, transporting armies of millions, established the foundations of modern industrial logistics. And there is the memorial tradition, the cenotaph in London, the Menin Gate in Ypres, where the names of 54,896 soldiers who died in the Ypres salient and have no known grave are inscribed, and where the last post has been sounded at 8 p.m. every single evening since 1928, except during the German occupation of World War II. The Thiepval Memorial, with the names of 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme. The graves, endless, immaculate rows of white stones stretching across the French and Belgian countryside. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains 1.7 million graves and memorials in 153 countries. 1.7 million graves. From one war. Every year on November 11th, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the world still pauses. In London, the 2-minute silence is observed with extraordinary solemnity. In Paris, in Ottawa, in Canberra, in Pretoria, in New Delhi, in the small villages of Belgium and France, where the graves are still there, where the farmers still plow up shells from their fields every spring, what they call the iron harvest, a century of unexploded ordnance still surfacing from the earth. We remember. Why do we remember? Not because remembering prevents war. The record on that front is not encouraging. Not simply from duty to the dead, though that is real. We remember because these were people, not statistics, not footnotes. People who were young and afraid and brave and petty and noble and ordinary. People who had mothers and lovers and dreams and favorite songs and inside jokes with their mates. Thomas from Yorkshire, sitting in a trench, cold, wet, waiting. He came home. Millions like him didn't. Those who came home were never the same. Those who didn't leave behind holes in their families. Actual physical absences at dinner tables and harvest festivals and Christmas mornings that echoed forward through generations. My grandfather who never existed because the young man who would have been his father died in the mud of Passchendaele. Your ancestor whose life was bent into an unrecognizable shape by what they saw or what they lost. The ripples of the Great War are still in us. World War I was the product of choices. Specific individual choices made by specific individual people. Wilhelm II, who fired Bismarck and sent that blank check to Vienna. Berchtold and Conrad, the Austro-Hungarian leaders who chose war over diplomacy. The German generals who had written the war plan that required invading Belgium. The British Foreign Secretary who had not made Britain's treaty commitments clear enough to deter Germany. The Serbian intelligence operatives who funded and trained Gavrilo Princip's Black Hand. All of them made choices. Choices they could have made differently. The war was not inevitable. The machinery that produced it was built from human decisions, human miscalculations, human vanity, human failure of imagination. The lesson, if there is a lesson, is not that war is always and everywhere futile. Sometimes threats are real. Sometimes defense is necessary. Sometimes the choice is between war and something worse. The lesson of the Great War is more specific. That systems built for deterrence can become systems built for escalation. That alliances designed to prevent war can guarantee it. That military plans written for rational strategic purposes can become mechanisms that remove rational choice at the very moment it's most needed. That the gap between the cost of war and the goal of war can be widened to an insane degree by the machinery of modern industrial slaughter. And that the gap, once opened, is very hard to close. That leaders can be wrong. That experts can be wrong. That everyone being confident, everyone being sure, everyone knowing what they're doing, is no guarantee at all against catastrophe. The guns fired for the last time at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918. The silence that followed lasted 21 years. Then they fired again. Remember that. 11,954 graves. One cemetery. One small corner of one country. One war. Remember them.